In a quiet jazz cafe, a billionaire father watches in disbelief as a black waitress lets his disabled son lead a dance move. He can't move, can't speak, but in that moment, everything changes. For the first time in 8 years, his son was dancing, and he had no idea why. It happened in a place where no one expected miracles, a low-lit jazz cafe in the middle of downtown Atlanta. Rain tapping the windows like a soft warning, and a boy in a wheelchair waiting to be noticed. His name was Lucas. He was 8, and he didn't speak much. His father? Richard Langston, a man worth over $4.2 billion, a tech empire built on algorithms and silence. He wasn't the kind of man who cried, or laughed, or danced. He barely spoke unless it made money. But tonight, he wasn't a CEO. He was just a dad, a scared one. Lucas had been getting worse, withdrawn, unmoving. His doctors gave options, specialists, therapists. Every one of them came with charts, pills, and promises. None of them had worked. So Richard brought him here, a place where jazz hummed quietly through brick walls and people came to disappear. He chose the corner table, away from the stage, away from life. Lucas stared at his lap. Then she walked in. No spotlight, no music shift, just Amira. She wore an apron, sneakers, and the kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from work, but from carrying people who never ask if you're okay. She approached their table. "Water?" she asked, casual, but her voice softened when she turned to Lucas. "Hey, buddy, you like music?" Lucas didn't answer, but his fingers twitched. Just once. She noticed. Richard didn't. Amira crouched beside Lucas, her face now level with his. "You ever danced before?" Lucas blinked. Once, twice, then barely, almost imperceptibly, nodded. Richard leaned forward, confused. "He doesn't really," she cut him off gently. "It doesn't have to be perfect. Just real." She offered her hand. Lucas hesitated, then, slowly, trembling, took it. What happened next felt like time folding in on itself. She led him, gently, to the open space near the stage. The jazz trio didn't stop. No one else paid attention. But for Richard, the entire cafe disappeared, because his son, the boy who hadn't moved to music in years, was leading. It wasn't graceful, it wasn't coordinated, but it was his. Lucas lifted one arm, then the other. Amira moved with him, matching his rhythm, not correcting it. She wasn't guiding him, she was following. Richard gripped the edge of the table. He felt dizzy. This wasn't therapy. This wasn't science. This wasn't part of the 5-year plan he'd paid millions for. This was a boy, feeling joy. A boy dancing, not because someone told him to, but because someone believed he could. And in that moment, the billionaire, the genius, the builder of skyscrapers and search engines, cracked. He didn't cry, not yet, but something in him shifted. Something he hadn't felt in decades, not since the day Lucas was born. Hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe. Love isn't complicated. Sometimes it walks up to your table with a pitcher of water and asks your son if he likes music. Richard couldn't shake it. The image of Lucas, arms raised, eyes bright, moving to music like he belonged in it, played on a loop in his mind. It haunted him, not in a bad way, in a confusing way. That morning in his corner office 40 floors above the city, Richard stared at a contract worth $600 million. He was supposed to be preparing for a merger, but all he could think about was the waitress, Amira, and how she got his son to do what no one else had. Not with credentials, not with therapy dogs, not with 6-figure experts flown in from Europe. She did it with presence. Just her, a stranger, a black waitress with tired eyes and a calm voice. She saw Lucas, not as a patient, not as a problem, but as a child. He closed his laptop. For the first time in years, he skipped the meeting. That evening, he brought Lucas back to the cafe. Same corner table, same old saxophone player on stage, same smell of roasted coffee and worn-out wood floors. And there she was, moving from table to table with the same quiet focus. But when she saw Lucas, her face lit up. "Hey, dancer," she smiled, kneeling again, like it was the most normal thing in the world. Lucas turned toward her. Richard's breath caught. Amira reached out. "How was your day?" Lucas opened his mouth. Nothing came out at first, just a faint squeak of effort, then one word. "Gah, good." Richard nearly dropped his glass. It wasn't clear, it wasn't strong, but it was speech. Amira didn't react with shock. She just smiled wider. "I'm glad," she said softly. "Want to sit by the music again?" Lucas nodded, no hesitation this time. And so it began. A new rhythm. Every night after work, Richard didn't go to the gym, or the boardroom, or the next big thing. He went to the café. Lucas would roll in beside him, shoes untied, arms loose at his sides. And Amira, always in motion, would make time to greet him. Never forced, never fake, just real. Sometimes she told stories. Sometimes she brought a sketch pad and let him doodle. Other times she just sat with him, humming softly to the jazz. And something inside Lucas started waking up. Words came slowly, then more. Smiles came often. Laughter, actual laughter, broke through one night when Amira did a silly twirl and nearly knocked over a salt shaker. Richard couldn't believe it. For years he had chased progress with intensity, booked the best therapists, flew to Switzerland for trials, bought equipment that cost more than cars. But here in this tiny cafe, progress didn't feel like a treatment. It felt like freedom. One night, as they were leaving, Lucas tugged on his father's sleeve. "Can we go back?" Richard knelt down, looked him in the eye. "You want to come back tomorrow?" Lucas nodded, and for the first time since the diagnosis, Richard didn't feel like a provider. He felt like a father. Richard had always trusted data. He believed in hard numbers, predictive trends, measurable progress. But now he was following a feeling, and it was driving him insane. Each night he watched Lucas grow, alive. And every time it happened, Amira was right there, laughing with him, kneeling beside him, letting him lead when the rest of the world only ever guided. So Richard started paying closer attention, not to Lucas this time, but to her. The way she moved, the way she adapted her voice, the subtle hand gestures she used when Lucas struggled with words. She wasn't just kind, she was skilled. And it wasn't luck, it was intentional. One evening, while Lucas was sketching cartoon faces on a napkin Amira gave him, Richard finally asked, "Can I ask you something?" She didn't flinch. "Sure. You're not just a waitress, are you?" Amira paused, wiped her hands on her apron, then smiled, a little tired, a little proud. "Number I'm not." She slid into the booth across from him, checking on Lucas from the corner of her eye. "I was in my final year at Howard," she said. "Physical therapy major, specializing in pediatric neurology." Richard blinked. "That's specific," she chuckled. "Yeah, well, that's what happens when you grow up helping raise your younger brother with CP. It becomes personal." A beat. Richard's voice softened. "Why didn't you finish?" Her eyes shifted like they were carrying a weight older than her years. "My mom got sick. Cancer. Stage 4. Couldn't work. Insurance was garbage. I dropped out, picked up every job I could find. And the cafe, closest thing I could find to normal hours. And they let me keep my notebook on me." Richard looked down. Peeking from her apron pocket was a small, leather-bound journal. Edges worn, corners curled. He motioned to it. "What's in there?" Amira hesitated, then slid it across the table. Richard opened it. Inside were handwritten notes, dozens of them. Adaptive mirroring for motor deficits. Language priming through rhythm-based response. Lucas responds well to eye-level engagement. Try call and response games for retention. His throat tightened. "You've been studying him?" he asked. "No," she said quietly. "I've been learning from him." That moment hit Richard harder than any boardroom pitch ever had. Because here was a woman, unpaid, overworked, and unheard, doing what his million-dollar specialist never did, see his son as a person, not a patient. Later that night, Richard stood in his penthouse kitchen, staring at the city skyline. Lucas was asleep in the next room, and Amira's notebook sat on the counter. He flipped through the pages again. She wasn't just gifted. She wasn't just empathetic. She was exceptional. But no one knew it, because talent like hers doesn't shine in resumes or LinkedIn profiles. It blooms in quiet corners of jazz cafes when no one's watching. It hit without warning. One moment, Lucas was drawing stars on the back of a napkin with a green crayon. The next, his hand started trembling. Then his neck jerked. Then his eyes rolled back, and Richard froze. No, 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 Lucas! The crayon slipped from Lucas's fingers. His body stiffened, then convulsed violently. Lucas! Richard shouted, knocking over his chair. A waiter ran over. Someone called 911. The cafe blurred into chaos. Richard dropped to his knees, cradling Lucas's head, trying to remember what the doctors had said. Roll him on his side. Protect the airway. Don't hold him down. He couldn't breathe. His own heart felt like it was seizing. At the hospital, fluorescent lights burned his eyes. Nurses moved fast, speaking in clipped urgency. Lucas was hooked to machines, beeping, blinking, breathing for him. Richard stood in the hallway, fists clenched, chest heaving, surrounded by people, and yet utterly alone. He could call anyone, his assistant, his security, his private medical team in Zurich, but none of them mattered. His fingers moved without thinking. He called Amira. 3 rings. Hello? It's Lucas, he whispered. It's bad. I don't know what to do. No questions, no hesitation. I'm coming, she said. 20 minutes later, the elevator doors opened. Amira ran down the hallway, drenched from rain, hair clinging to her face, out of breath. She saw Richard, didn't say a word. She walked straight into the ICU room. Lucas was still, tubes in his nose, monitors dancing. Amira didn't flinch. She pulled a stool next to his bed, took his hand gently in both of hers and whispered, Hey, I'm here. She hummed, a jazz melody, software familiar, the same one from the cafe. And then, Lucas's fingers twitched. Once, then twice. The heart monitor steadied. The nurse glanced at it, eyebrows raised. That's remarkable. Richard stood at the doorway, watching her, watching them, and something inside him broke. Not the kind of break that ruins you, the kind that frees you. Tears fell, not dramatic ones, silent, heavy ones that had been waiting behind his eyes for 8 long years. He sat down, head in his hands, and cried. Later, the doctor entered, middle-aged, calm, serious. He sat beside Richard and spoke quietly. Your son's seizure was stress-induced. His brain is overwhelmed by expectations, environments he doesn't feel safe in. But when she walked in, it stopped. Richard didn't respond. The doctor nodded toward Amira through the glass. She's not a nurse? No, Richard whispered. Well, maybe she should be. A pause, then the doctor leaned forward. You have all the resources in the world, Mr. Langston, but sometimes healing doesn't come from treatment plans. It comes from connection. That night, Richard rode in the back of his black SUV. Lucas was asleep beside him, peaceful, but Richard wasn't thinking about the next hospital or another therapy session. He was thinking about Amira, about how she ran in the rain for a boy who wasn't hers, about how his own son had never looked at anyone the way he looked at her, about how sometimes love doesn't need blood, it just needs to show up. And maybe that's what parenting really is, not being perfect, just showing up, even in the rain. The invitation came in a black envelope, no logo, no letterhead, just an address. When Amira arrived, she hesitated at the entrance. A 40-story tower, polished glass, gold-trimmed lobby, the kind of building where people whispered and walked fast, the kind of place that never had room for people like her. But here she was, jeans, worn boots, curls tied up in a loose scarf, standing in the elevator as it rose, floor by floor, toward the sky. At the top, Richard stood in front of a long window, watching the city below. Lucas was there too, spinning slowly in his wheelchair, humming the café song under his breath. "Hi," Amira said softly. Lucas beamed. Richard turned, and for once he looked unsure. "I don't usually do this," he said. "I don't make decisions without contracts, legal teams, due diligence." She waited. "But I've watched you do in 3 weeks what teams of experts couldn't manage in 3 years. He gestured to a seat. She didn't take it. He pulled out a folder. "Full scholarship, any school, any country, paid in full. Also, this building's yours if you want it, for a therapy center. Staffing, equipment, name it. And a salary." She blinked. "A what?" "6 figures. Benefits? Title. Director of Pediatric Movement Development. You'd work with Lucas, full-time." Silence stretched between them. Any other person might have screamed, yes, might have cried. Thanked him, not Amira. She glanced down at the folder, then up again. "I'm honored," she said. "Really, but I can't take it." Richard frowned. "Why not?" "Because I don't just care about Lucas." She stepped closer, her voice steady, strong. "There are hundreds of kids like him, thousands. Kids with no fathers in towers, kids in shelters, in underfunded schools, who'll never get to dance because no one ever believed they could." She paused. "I'll take the job, but only if we make this bigger than your son. Only if we build something that gives every child a chance." Richard stared at her, not angry, in awe. She wasn't impressed by his offer. She was answering a calling. That night, in a dim conference room surrounded by glass and sky, they sketched out the future. It wouldn't be a therapy center. It would be a movement, an initiative that blended music, dance, physical therapy, and emotional safety. Free for families who couldn't afford it. Led by people who cared more about heart than credentials. Amira called it the Lucas Langston Movement Project. Richard said the name out loud. It was the first time his son's name sounded like hope. When they left that room, they weren't just a billionaire and a waitress. They were partners. 2 people from opposite worlds joined by one truth. Every child deserves a moment to lead. It began in a repurposed community center on the south side of Atlanta. Peeling walls, flickering lights, a space that once smelled of old gym socks and broken promises, now filled with music, movement, and children who had been told their bodies were too broken to dance. At the front of the room, Amira led the session. She didn't call them patients. She called them dancers. Wheelchairs rolled in rhythm. Braces moved in beat. Some kids moved a finger. Others bounced on toes. Every movement, no matter how small, was celebrated. And in the center of it all was Lucas, spinning slowly, laughing freely. He had become the project's soul. Word spread faster than they expected. Soon there were locations in Detroit, then Baltimore, then New Orleans. Each one painted in calming blues and golds. Each one welcoming children with conditions and stories that society too often ignored. But they didn't stop at therapy. Scholarships were created for minority students studying physical therapy and movement science. Amira personally mentored half of them. And at every ribbon-cutting ceremony, every launch party, Lucas stood proudly beside her, smiling in his little blazer, his shoes slightly scuffed, his curls always wild. He wasn't just a participant, he was a leader. Then came the video. It wasn't staged, just a phone clip, shaky, unfiltered, real. Lucas at a charity gala danced in the middle of a circle of children, one hand in the air, one foot leading. The music swelled. The kids cheered. At the edge of the dance floor, Amira clapped, proud. Richard wiped tears quietly. Someone uploaded it to TikTok. By morning, it had 1.2 million views. By night, it had 10. By the end of the week, the Lucas Langston Movement Project was a hashtag, a headline, a heartbeat across the nation. Reporters came. Celebrities reached out. Donations poured in. But Richard didn't stand in front of cameras. He stood behind Amira, letting her speak, letting Lucas shine. He had built an empire with his mind. Now he was helping build a movement with his heart. One night, months later, Richard sat on the porch of a new therapy center in Oakland. Lucas sat next to him, head on his shoulder, half asleep. Amira stood by the edge of the dance floor, laughing with a little girl who had just taken her first unassisted step. And Richard, for the first time in decades, felt something stronger than success. Peace. He had spent years chasing billions, but it turned out the real legacy was just a boy who danced, and a woman who dared to believe he could. Not every story ends with fireworks. Some end quietly, with a boy falling asleep after dancing and a billionaire smiling because for once, he didn't have to fix anything. He just had to be there. Lucas never became a celebrity, but he became something bigger, a symbol of what's possible when we lead with patience and follow with love. He didn't speak at conferences, but his movements spoke louder than any keynote. A lift of the hand, a crooked step, a quiet smile that told the world, I matter. And Amira, she never asked for fame, but her work lit a fire across the country. Therapists stopped looking at clipboards and started listening. Children who had been told to sit still were now being told to move, however they could. And in every city where the foundation grew, one truth remained. You don't have to be rich to change a life. You just have to show up and care. As for Richard Langston, he still wore suits, still signed deals. But now on his office wall, there wasn't a stock certificate. There was a crayon drawing of a boy dancing in front of a jazz band, drawn by Lucas, signed in uneven handwriting. Thank you, Dad. We often think legacy is built in gold, concrete, or headlines. But the truth is, it's built in moments. Moments where we choose compassion over convenience, presence over prestige, people over power. So here's the question, Johnny. What will you choose? Because somewhere out there, there's a child who needs to be seen, a voice waiting to be heard, a step waiting to be led. And maybe, just maybe, you're the one who shows up. If this story touched something inside you, take a moment, drop a comment, share your experience. And if you believe kindness can be louder than wealth, hit that like button, because the world doesn't need more billionaires. It needs more people like Amira and more dads who are finally ready to dance.